Oops.
Welcome to The World According to Mark. This is Mark Lieberman, your show of the host, The World According to Mark. And we're coming to you through WPVM LP, an FM station in Asheville, North Carolina. And my guest today is Marshall Fisher. Marshall, thanks for being on the show. And my show is built around Marshall's interesting, somewhat unusual, I won't call it a hobby because he's dedicated many, many years of his life, but the topic is kaleidoscopes. And I saw an article referring to Mr. Fisher and his involvement with kaleidoscopes in many, many fascinating ways. And I thought, how about a change of pace? Let's talk about something that doesn't raise any political or social issues per se, although maybe there's some that I missed. So again, Marshall, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Mark.
So you have a sort of mathematical, analytical, technical background, and you can tell us about that, but you did that for many years. And then at some point you decided, or circumstances were such that you took up a hobby. You probably had other hobbies in your life, and you still do. I know you, besides kaleidoscopes, you make furniture and so on and so forth. But there obviously was something that was really grabbing, for want of a better phrase, that caused you to be interested in this. And so why don't you start out telling us about, tell us a little bit about your professional background, and then we can talk about how you got into kaleidoscopes, or got out of the kaleidoscope and into our living rooms.
Well, thanks, Mark. Yes, my career was in satellite systems and telecommunications. I'm an engineer. I have master's degrees in mathematics and computer science. And I had an opportunity to travel many parts of the world to establish satellite-based communication systems. It was a great career. When people see my kaleidoscopes, more often than not, they make a comment, "Oh, I had one of those when I was a kid." Well, what they remember having is the same thing that I had. When people of my generation had toy kaleidoscopes with cardboard tubes, plastic lenses, pretty crummy mirrors. These are easy to find today. I saw my first real kaleidoscopes in the late 80s at a kaleidoscope exhibit at Strathmore Hall in Bethesda, Maryland. That's close to where I was living at that time. This was one of the first exhibits ever of kaleidoscopes in a serious way anywhere in the world. And I was awed by the complexity, the sharpness, the perfect symmetry of these images and these kaleidoscopes. They were so far beyond anything that I had ever seen before, I couldn't get them out of my mind. I've been an amateur artist and a woodworker as a hobbyist for as long as I can remember. And I started to think, perhaps I could actually try to make one of these kaleidoscopes. At that time, there were very few sources of information about how to make a quality kaleidoscope, and very few places to obtain the materials that you needed. They just weren't available in stores or even other sources. There were very few kaleidoscope artists active at that time, probably no more than a couple dozen in the world. And without the internet, there was no simple way to share information among ourselves. So I spent several years kind of on my own, experimenting with mirrors, lenses, colored objects before I had a kaleidoscope that I was willing to actually show to people. I entered my first craft show in 1994 in Rockville, Maryland. It was pretty simple. A few kaleidoscopes on a card table. I had to take orders because if anyone bought one and took it away, I had no more to show. Later, I developed a more professional booth, and my wife and I spent quite a few years going to craft shows all over the place, both small and large. I remember standing outside in a tent in December, freezing at an outdoor craft show, very ill-advised. And eventually we did the American Craft Council shows at big convention centers like Atlanta. I continued to participate in craft shows and exhibits until about 2019. I'm always searching for new materials and techniques to incorporate in new designs. It's always an interesting thing. Everywhere we go, we look for new things that I could incorporate into kaleidoscopes. A few years ago, my wife and I spent some time in Venice, in Italy, and on a visit to the island of Murano, a famous glassmaking island, I found a glassmaker who made his own Marini. Marini is a kind of glass that he used in his finished work. He spoke no English and I spoke no Italian, and it was a struggle to explain to him that I actually
just use your hands. Isn't that what they do? But go ahead.
He wanted that I wanted to buy a quantity of Marini to bring home to use in my kaleidoscopes. Eventually, he understood and dragged out a big sack from his workshop and let me purchase 1 kilogram of them.
So
He's
a kilogram is
still puzzling over why I wanted
why you did it. A kilogram is what, 2.5 pounds essentially?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And you were able to get that past TSA or
eventually? Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. They kind of looked at me funny too, but didn't ask too many questions. Now my kaleidoscopes are available at the Seven Sisters Gallery in Black Mountain, and also on my website. It's opticalwonders.com. So
I want to just press you a little bit on the transition. I mean, you are an engineer. When somebody uses that term, I think of someone who's precise, someone who incorporates mathematical principles, typically not abstract, I wouldn't think. And particularly if you're working on satellites and things that require precision, there's not a lot of artistic per se aspects of that. But have you ever asked yourself why this particular, I mean, people I picked up kaleidoscopes, gone to art fairs and liked them and bought a couple in my day. But obviously it would never have occurred to me that I could work with them and create them, improve upon them, or whatever. What do you think that was in your background that caused you to not just be interested in this, but to actually, it spoke to your core in some way?
Well, I think I see more close parallels between engineering and art than perhaps you have described. In mathematics, mathematicians view solutions to problems not only in terms of does it solve the problem, but is it beautiful? And beautiful solutions, beautiful proofs are more often than not simple. The simplicity, symmetry, suitability of the solution is very, very important. So that's really true in many forms of art too, especially in kaleidoscopes. It's certainly true in music. The advisability of or the desirability of a piece of music is in fact related very much to its symmetry. That's true in art. And in kaleidoscopes, it's very true. In fact, you can look at a kaleidoscope as essentially a machine to generate symmetry. And I think it's essential to the human appreciation of beauty to find symmetry in things. Certainly, there had been research showing that if shown photographs of people's faces, which are a real face, and a human face is not totally symmetric, but a computer-generated image of a face can be symmetric. It's been shown that people very often prefer the computer-generated perfectly symmetric face to a face of a real person. So I think there's an ingrained bias toward symmetry in the human mind. And kaleidoscopes, being generators of symmetry, I think are intentionally attractive. So from a mathematician's point of view, I think symmetry and simplicity of an image is very important. And I think that the generation of symmetric images in kaleidoscopes is very much up the alley of a person who is an engineer.
Yeah, and listening to you talk, obviously, my introduction of that aspect of it was showed some naivete on my part. I'm not that naive. I do know, for example, that throughout history, Leonardo da Vinci, as a classic example, was a scientist, an engineer, probably a mathematician, and obviously created great art. So there's no reason why a person, not only no reason, but there clearly is a direct relationship between people who have scientific minds and also artistic minds. But I'm just wondering, and again, this is a little off the beaten path, so you'll forgive me, is a lot of the art that is generated today that you see in art galleries is, I'm sure there's symmetry there that I might be missing, but some of the more abstract art that doesn't show patterns, that is cryptic to the extent that you don't know what it's depicting. Mm-hmm. I wonder about those folks. Are they different types of, and you may not be able to speak to this, but I wonder if those folks approach art in a fashion very different from you and very different from some of the classical artists that we still revere and appreciate today.
Oh, I think that's probably very true. I mean, in music, look at John Cage. You know, that is totally unstructured, apparently unstructured, and yet it's extremely artistic. So certainly kaleidoscopes and related art that's related to engineering in some way is certainly not the only art there is.
Okay. I should have mentioned this earlier to those who are looking at or listening to us and viewing us on Facebook. You have this virtual kaleidoscopic image, shall we say, behind you. You want to talk about that a little bit? Because it's truly beautiful.
That is actually a photograph taken through one of my kaleidoscopes and used as a zoom background. I often spend, after I make a new kaleidoscope, I spend some hours taking photographs through it under various circumstances. And of course, as the kaleidoscope object rotates, the image changes constantly. Sometimes I'll even make videos through it. And those are very satisfying. But very frankly, looking at a photograph taken through a kaleidoscope and looking through the actual scope are completely different things. And I would not recommend people focusing on photographs, but pick up a kaleidoscope and actually use it.
So you've been, for those who are just tuning in, my guest today is Marshall Fisher, who has an extraordinarily diverse background in terms of being an engineer, but also took up, I guess, as a hobby or artistic endeavor. You didn't decide that you're going to make a gazillion dollars producing kaleidoscopes, and he's been experimenting, inventing, perfecting his art for over 20 years. So I wanted to reintroduce that fact, but also tell us a little bit about the craft itself, what it takes to create a kaleidoscope, the components, and so on and so forth.
Sure. Kaleidoscopes are actually very, very simple. Every kaleidoscope has three parts. It has mirrors. It has a case to protect the mirrors and to make it look beautiful on the outside. And it has one or more objects that move one way or another. Every kaleidoscope has a prism or tube of mirrors, and the mirrors face each other so that when an image appears at one end of the tube, it's multiply reflected many, many times as the image as perceived by your eye at the other end. So those multiple reflections, that's where the symmetry comes from. The symmetry is not what you're looking at. It's actually generated by the mirrors. Toy kaleidoscopes have mirrors generally made of plastic that are cheap. The disadvantage is that they distort the reflections. They produce an image that's murky and indistinct. A quality kaleidoscope will be made of a totally different kind of mirror called front surface mirror. They call it front surface because the silver coating in your home, the mirrors are coated on the back. And the reason for that is to protect them, because you're going to clean the mirrors and the silver coating is protected from the abrasion of being cleaned. On the other hand, in your home, and if you look closely, you can tell this, the image that you see passes through the glass twice, once on its way to the silver coating and once on its way out. Every time light passes from one medium to another, air to glass, glass to air, it produces an error of refraction. That error is visible to you if you look closely enough. And in a kaleidoscope, that error is very undesirable. So a good kaleidoscope will be made of front surface mirror where the silver is very much on the front, totally on the front, so that the image does not pass through the glass at all. It bounces right off the silver coating and back to your eye. Of course, that's not practical in your home because you couldn't clean it. It would scratch. The purpose of the case of a kaleidoscope is primarily to protect the mirrors, first of all. So this way, with front surface mirror, there is no error and the image is extremely clear.
So you mentioned, I think maybe before we talked, that you don't mass produce kaleidoscopes.
Mm-hmm.
In your early days, and perhaps to the present, if you would exhibit it at a convention where the kaleidoscopes were for sale, you didn't pull out, box number 13 for kaleidoscope number 747 and sell it.
Right.
So it's somewhat or maybe exactly a customized item, no two being exactly alike. Is that a fair statement?
I try hard to make sure that I never make the same exact kaleidoscope twice.
Okay.
Both on principle and as a practical matter. If I make the first kaleidoscope of a given design, that's a tremendous challenge. The second one to some extent too, because I'm trying to make it even better. After that, it becomes a job. I had a job. I don't want another job.
Okay.
I'm retired and proud of it. So no, I try not to go into production on a given kaleidoscope. Sometimes I will make 2 or 3 of the same design if customers request it, but I try not to do very much of that.
So let me ask you this question, just probing a bit. When you're going into making a new kaleidoscope, do you have the image in your mind? Do you put the image on paper? Do you know in advance essentially what you're looking for? And I'm sure that, I don't want this to be insulting. It's not just random. It doesn't just happen. You must, as an engineer, you probably couldn't do that. You'd have to have something. But how does that process of what you ultimately come up with and what you've seen or envisioned, how does that take place?
Well, there are predictions that I can make about the symmetry of a kaleidoscope because I understand the relationship between the number of mirrors and how they come together and the effect that will have on the symmetry. What I can't at all predict is the color, the texture, the ultimate complexity of the image. That's not predictable. That's a matter of experimentation. And so there's a lot of experimenting with mirrors and experimenting with the objects that I put at the end of the scope, as well as how they move, how they rotate. Some of them rotate in one plane and others rotate in a different plane. That has a great deal to do with what you see through the kaleidoscope. So there's some design involved, but there's also a lot of experimentation.
So in terms of the experimentation, again, I have no idea how you can get all that stuff in a little box, but while you're making it, which I don't know if the word assembling it is a correct term, but are you looking at it and saying, nah, I don't like this particular thing, or it would work better, and then you're able to make substitutions of the color or the type of glass or whatever you're using? Is that what goes on?
Yes, yes, very much. I have a large collection or inventory of stuff that I can try in the kaleidoscope cell, for example. Some of the parts that I use are commercially available, beads, things like that. More often, what I do is I have a torch that I melt glass using, and I'll take rods of glass and extrude over the torch small pieces of glass in certain configurations, certain colors, certain combinations of colors, and I'll use those in the kaleidoscope cell, which gives me a lot of latitude in terms of what I can put in. And until if it's, as long as it's not a cell that's filled with oil, which sometimes I do, if it's a dry cell, then I can take things out, put things in, try them, and keep going until I'm happy with the result.
So you mentioned your home in Black Mountain, and as you were talking, I remember reading about you that you designed your house to have two separate studios. Yeah. You really went full in on this, Marshall. So you have one place where the case is made, I guess, and the other where the kaleidoscope guts, essentially, for want of a better word, are made. And that was essential, I guess, in building the house. Does your house look like a kaleidoscope from the outside?
No. No, it's an arts and crafts style home. Yeah, we live on a mountain, side of a mountain. It's a very nice situation. I can look out both my wood studio and my glass studio windows and enjoy the view. Today is just beautiful. And we basically live in the woods, so we can't see our neighbors. It's very isolated, and it's quite peaceful place to work. Sometimes we even get bears visiting us. We have a lot of bears on the mountain, and a few weeks ago, a family of bears visited me in my wood studio, not in, but at, and they checked me out for a while. I looked at them, they looked at me, and finally they kind of wandered away. I guess they thought, it's not that interesting after all.
Yeah, they were they were looking at your inventory, and they said, "This guy, he's not of our kind." Okay. So what goes on in let's take the two different labs. What goes on in the case or studio where you make the outside? And it is primarily wood, is that correct? Or do you do metal and wood?
Not entirely. I started out making wood kaleidoscopes, wood bodies, and I enjoyed that, and I still do. But not every kaleidoscope has a wooden body and a wooden component. In my wood studio, that's where I do the wooden bodies of kaleidoscopes, but I also do other things. I make art and crafts furniture. I do toys for my grandchildren, which they enjoy, and I enjoy making them. So I do a lot of different kinds of woodwork. The glass studio is required not only as just a place to do other kinds of glass work as well, but it's important to assemble the kaleidoscope. The final assembly has to be in an area that's quite dust free. I can't do that in a wood shop. There's too much dust around. So I will do what I need to do in the wood studio, and then I'll move to the glass studio for assembly. And that works quite well. Dust inside a kaleidoscope is very visible. So the last step before sealing up the kaleidoscope is to use compressed air to clean out any dust in the mirrors that there might be. And then seal it up and protect it.
Okay. So you mentioned in your story about your trip to Venice and picking up uh, 2.5 pounds a kilogram. My metric system was never my favorite part of math, but picking that up, these Marinis, I guess what you were saying about that is that that type of glass has some unique characteristics that lend themselves very nicely to the innards of a kaleidoscope. But you don't have to just use glass. And I'm wondering, have you found other sources of glass? You're not, I don't assume you're still working off the same kilogram in in terms of your work. So what are the types of things? I read somewhere where you can put a flower in this, or you mentioned a bead or whatever. So what types of components are you using these days?
Primarily, as I described, I use the torch to make pieces of my own design and my own choice. That gives me a lot of more freedom than relying on commercially available objects. But Marini is an example of something that works well in a kaleidoscope cell, because the things that work well are small, generally brightly colored, transparent, and tumble well. In quite a few of the cells that I make, the objects fall, they tumble past the end of the kaleidoscope lens, and that's what produces the movement in the kaleidoscope pattern. Sometimes I will leave the tumbling to be loose like that, so that they tumble quickly, which is a typical what people remember as a kaleidoscope. Most kaleidoscopes that people have seen tumble freely. The other option is to fill the cell with a transparent fluid, an oil, which is a very popular thing to do. And the result of that is that the tumbling is in slow motion.
Because of the viscous nature of the oil, it doesn't just drop. Okay.
The oil allows the pieces to float past the end of the kaleidoscope rather than fall past. And that actually produces a very peaceful arrangement, a peaceful pattern, something that moves gently. A lot of people find that relaxing.
So you mentioned also that, well, let's go back a little bit to, again, sort of history here. The kaleidoscope goes back historically to around or perhaps exactly to the 1880s. And there was a single guy who's credited or considered to be the founder. Tell us a little bit more about the history, and let's talk about how the acceptance of this artistry and this craft across the world. So starting with its origins.
Well, it started with a man named David Brewster. He was a Scotsman living in England. He was a rich man. People at that time with money often dabbled in scientific pursuits as a hobby, or and not as a job, but just because he was interested in it. He was one of those people. He not only invented the kaleidoscope, and this was in 1816 that he patented it, or attempted to patent it. Actually, he didn't do a good job on the patent application, and so he didn't make money off of it as he intended to do. Other people did. But
he wasn't smart enough to get a lawyer?
No, apparently not.
Okay, go ahead.
So he did invent it. He also invented other things. For example, in a lighthouse, there are large glass lenses of a certain design which focus the light outward. He actually he designed those as well and invented those as well, but he again did not patent them correctly. And another person in France named Fresnel did. So we know them as Fresnel lenses today, but they should be called Brewster lenses. In any case, he did invent them, and they did become quite popular in England, especially in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. They were never invented as a toy, never intended that way, and never produced that way. They were produced in quantity as optical instruments and they were viewed that way. They were very desirable as something that you would have in a Victorian parlor. If you had a kaleidoscope in your home and people visited you, they might very well see that as a sign of your erudition, sign of your sophistication, very, very much an indicator that you were a sophisticated person. That's the way they maintained, and for the late until the late 1800s. Then they kind of faded away and got overtaken by other things. And then during the Depression years, they came back, but as toys, as cheap cardboard toys. And of course, that's the way most of us knew them until the 1980s or so.
So in a way, not to degrade it, in the early days of kaleidoscopes in the 1800s, they were a sign of status, not necessarily like a Cadillac Escalade, but they were a sign that you had that you had achieved a certain status, that you had appreciation for art, that because of the mechanical and scientific and mathematical nature of it, a sign that you had an active and engaged mind, and that's the sort of thing that people in those days who had wealth and weren't working in the factory for 14 hours were able to create. But then they fell out of favor. And as you say, maybe it's because there were other things. Like at some point along came, I don't know, telephones, telegraphs, radios to occupy people's minds, and kaleidoscope became less important and obviously less of a sign of status. And the people that wanted to still see the beauty associated with it, they might not get the best quality, but they were available at a price that most folks could afford. That's sort of the narrative of this.
Right.
Okay. So bringing it further into focus, no pun intended, I guess, is you mentioned when we first began that you had traveled extensively in your money-making career, the career part of your career, and you traveled to lots of places. And I don't know, I know Japan was one place, and then at some point you went back to Japan for a convention. And I don't know if that's the Brewster Society or whatever, but can you talk a little bit about sort of your world travels that then led you to be able to convene with other folks that had a similar interest or in and around kaleidoscopes?
Yes. Well, there is, as you alluded to, there is an international kaleidoscope community. People all over the world make kaleidoscopes, but there is also a professional organization or an international kaleidoscope makers and collectors organization called the Brewster Society, Brewster Kaleidoscope Society, which I've been a part of that for a number of years now, and I found it to be an essential part of a kaleidoscope artist's life.
Which is why
it is the best way to get together with other kaleidoscope artists and kaleidoscope people who appreciate kaleidoscopes and collect them. And it's very important. We have the association or the society has an expo or convention every year. The last 2 years it's been virtual, but in 2022 we will be meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, and in 2023 in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Close to home here.
Close to home, yes. Looking forward to that. In 2017, our convention was in Kyoto, Japan. And my wife and I traveled there for the convention, and it was quite an experience. If you look at where in the world kaleidoscope artists live, most of them mostly are in the United States. After that, there's a very strong contingent in Japan. Japan is certainly the second most likely place to find a serious kaleidoscope artist. And the Japanese are very creative and very skilled in the way that they design and make kaleidoscopes. Very precise and very colorful. I have a high degree of respect and appreciation for Japanese kaleidoscope makers. So we had a wonderful trip there. I'm hoping to go back as soon as I can.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about what goes on at those conventions, but let me pause for a moment and just see, do you have any sense of why Japan, why there's such an interest among the artistic community there versus, quote, any other place in the world?
I'm not sure I know why that is. It certainly is true. And the kaleidoscope artists that from Japan whom I know are very enthusiastic and very supportive of each other, which is generally true in the kaleidoscope community. There is a lot of sharing of information, free exchange of ideas and suggestions among all kaleidoscope artists. It's a very supportive environment, supportive community. In Japan, that's especially true. And the Japanese often use technological aspects in their kaleidoscopes, lighting or music or sound or motion, which is more often than not used in Japanese kaleidoscopes. It's very beautiful.
I mean, there is something about, again, maybe this is a sort of an internal bias. There is something about when you look at the images that looks like something that was produced in Japan or some Asian country because of the arrangement of the colors. But I'm sure the same can be said of other cultures and other countries. And this, India probably has some contribution to make to the kaleidoscope community. But nevertheless, you were highly influenced and at your first international convention in Kyoto. And again, like any other convention, I'm guessing there were lectures on how to, new ideas. Maybe there were lectures on marketing, which maybe you didn't attend because that wasn't your passion, but there must be a way in which people not only appreciate each other's works, but as you say, contribute and give suggestions. Is that sort of the way that worked?
Yes, that's very true. Kaleidoscope artists, quite a few classes are held at each convention. The convention is open to the public. If you join the Kaleidoscope Society, which is very inexpensive to do, you can attend the convention and you can attend classes and learn to make kaleidoscopes from some of the most expert people in the world, which I highly recommend. The other thing that happens at a kaleidoscope, and it's kind of a tradition in the society, is that every kaleidoscope artist is invited to, and most do, unveil a kaleidoscope in front of the group. An unveiling is literally a kaleidoscope that has never been seen before, that you have invented, and you come up in front of the group and it's covered with a veil, and you unveil it and you present your work in front of the community of kaleidoscope artists, which is kind of intimidating the first time because, of course, you're presenting your work at a point in your career where you're just starting out in front of some of the most inventive and accomplished kaleidoscope artists in the world. So it can be a little off-putting, but the community is very supportive. People are very appreciative of your work, no matter what you've done. And that's really gets a lot of people started.
So again, the supportive community would suggest to me that there's no competition at these conventions of the, quote, best kaleidoscope. Everybody just shows their whatever their particular invention is, and and people appreciate it, comment about it, but you don't give first prize or first runner up.
Well, no, that's not the case.
Okay.
There is voting held, both for Kaleidoscope members, or society members, as well as the general public who comes through the sales room during the weekend of the convention. You get to vote for my favorite Kaleidoscope, and so that's rewarding. But in terms of competition, I would say no. That's a minor aspect of it. We are appreciative of whoever wins those competitions, but nevertheless, there's a whole lot of talented people involved, and they all do good work.
Okay, so tell us a bit about how many people would you estimate are devoted to this art? As you say, they maybe self-identify through what the Brewster Society or otherwise. How many people across the world are actively involved in this?
Well, there are people who actually make their living as kaleidoscope artists. That's probably not a large number. I'm going to guess 50 people in the world are professional kaleidoscope artists, and how they make their living. There's probably another 100 to 150 people like me who regard it as a serious pursuit and work hard at it, but our lives don't depend on it. So I'm going to guess 200 people total in the world, and that would be just kind of an unfunded estimate, but I think it's pretty close.
That's a pretty elite group in terms of numbers. You mentioned that people who are not necessarily part of the actual production end of this can also attend. How many people do tend to come to these conventions?
Oh, hundreds. We will get 500, 600 people coming to a typical convention. And the sales room and exhibit hall are generally open on Saturday and Sunday. And a lot of people come. A lot of people actually travel some distances to attend this. There are not too many kaleidoscope conventions anywhere in the world in a given year. There is in Jerome, Arizona, there is a shop which is dedicated to kaleidoscopes. It's called Nellie Bly in Jerome, and that's a haven for kaleidoscope collectors and kaleidoscope artists. And every year in October, they have a sort of a get together where a lot of people go to Jerome for that purpose.
Nellie Bly sounds like a Western character, but
well,
a gunslinger perhaps. We won't tell that story, right? Okay. All right. My guest today is Marshall Fisher. He is a hobbyist, I guess, with kaleidoscopes. He's been doing it making them, and being involved generally in the art for over 20 years. And he makes his home on a mountain in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And we've been talking about the history of it and the enthusiasm for it. Let me ask you a question. If someone wanted to, well, first of all, do you mentor anyone, or have you been mentored? Do you teach classes or ones or twos of people, or is that the sort of thing that you do?
Well, certainly I have been mentored in the sense that I've gotten a lot of information from fellow kaleidoscope artists. There is one other very advanced kaleidoscope artist in the Asheville area, by the way. His name is Mark Tickle, and he's kind of someone I look up to, and many people do, as a very inventive kaleidoscope artist. In terms of mentoring other people, I have developed a kind of a class that I have taught in to various groups, certainly several times to people in the community where I live and typically they are not familiar with kaleidoscopes. So I spend a little time explaining them to them, and then I help them to make a kaleidoscope of their own. I have developed a little kit that I use for that purpose. And they enjoy that, and they come away with an appreciation of what goes into a kaleidoscope, and they can take one home and experiment with it by themselves.
So if somebody wanted to build their own. I'm guessing not something that would work out terribly well for somebody who was just doing it in their basement by themselves. They would, instruction or mentoring would be appropriate. But what kind of time commitment would it take to develop the skill to make even one? And then what is the time that it usually takes to go from from conception to the real thing?
Well, there are a number of ways to get started. If you have an ability to cut glass, then you can cut mirror. And despite the fact that what I said about household mirror versus front surface mirror, certainly if you started out with household mirror and made a prism of it, you would get an idea for what was involved, and you would have a kaleidoscope that was an honest kaleidoscope, and maybe not a high quality one. There are online sources for front surface mirror that's already cut to the dimensions that would be appropriate for a kaleidoscope. So you could order front surface mirror that's already cut and make it that way. And then you can hold up in front of that kaleidoscope prism pretty much anything you find around the house to see how it would look. Also, I should mention that if you omit the turning object that is typically at the end of a kaleidoscope and just look through the mirrored tube, what you're looking through is called a kaleidoscope. A kaleidoscope is a kaleidoscope without the object. And there, the pattern is generated by whatever you happen to be looking at. You could be looking at flowers, you could look at bugs, you could look at leaves, you could look at clouds, anything you have in the house, and you have a fantastic experience just experimenting with looking at various things through a kaleidoscope. So that's the simplest possible thing.
Easy one to make because you're not easy, but easier to make because you're not throwing a bunch of things into the kaleidoscope. You're looking at, okay. Right. You mentioned earlier the person, again, Brewster, credited with founding it. You also have a story, a short story perhaps, about Cozy Baker, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, I've alluded to the fact that kaleidoscopes started a kind of a resurgence in the late 1980s. It's really one person behind that. Her name was Cozy Baker. She became interested in kaleidoscopes as a way to recover from a personal loss. She had a close relative who died, and she was torn apart by that and she was looking for something to
occupy her time.
Her attention, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So she dedicated the rest of her life to fostering the concept of kaleidoscopes as art. She organized exhibits, and she organized the one at Strathmore Hall that introduced me to kaleidoscopes. She wrote a series of books about the art of kaleidoscopes, and she built a personal collection, which was immense and which helped many early artists to get their start. She passed away in 2010. And she's someone that I really am honored to have met. She was an amazing person.
Talk about what you're working on now. I know you mentioned that there's an expo coming up that you plan to attend. Is that what's occupying you a lot, or do you have some other interesting new projects on the horizon?
Well, I'm starting to work on the design of a kaleidoscope that I will unveil in St. Louis next May. It takes a while to percolate the ideas a little bit. Lately, I design kaleidoscopes from the inside out. So I experiment with mirrors and decide on a mirror geometry that produces the kind of symmetry that I'm interested in. And once I've got that, then I start thinking about what the housing or the case for that kaleidoscope should be to protect the mirrors, but also to make a beautiful object to look at. I think it's important that a kaleidoscope be beautiful on the outside as well as on the inside. And so once I have the mirror geometry in place, then I start thinking about the case. The last couple of years, my unveiled kaleidoscopes have had kind of a nature theme. One had representation of a lily pad that a frog might live on. And last year it was butterflies. So I haven't decided yet what it'll be for next year, but probably something along that line.
Okay. So I want to go into a sort of a tangent here. We've got several minutes left, and I want to make sure we cover a lot of the significance of kaleidoscopes. Obviously, as you've described it on the show, in a way, it's a complex instrument. Fundamentally, it's only got 3 parts, so there's not a lot of complexity in terms of numbers of parts, but the precision, the variations, the things you can do with it. And you've got a dedicated following, I guess, but not large numbers of people that are actively involved. And you have people that are enthusiastic about seeing the exhibits, paying to go to an international exhibit, but it's a relatively small group of people. We are living in a time where there's in Asheville, as an example, in the Asheville area, there's tons of artisans and artists and craftspeople, and they're making things that people are more conventionally accustomed to, glassware that has some utility, or paintings you stick on the wall. But we see as a society that people gravitate towards things where, you just look at it or you just hear it. People walk around with headphones on all the time. People are on their phones looking at images. There's tons of things that you can do. And there's an artistry, obviously, in applications for phones. But how do you see all this? You observe this as a person of your generation, and in terms of the relevance, and maybe you don't think about that, the relevance of what it is that you're doing, and whether it'll survive to the next generation, whether there'll be other applications of this. What's your thoughts on that?
A couple things come to mind. I think kaleidoscopes are a different art form, in part because there is interaction. You do interact with the kaleidoscope. You pick it up. In the case of a kaleidoscope, you decide what to point it at. In the case of a typical kaleidoscope, you operate the kaleidoscope in the sense that you move something, you turn something, you have a hand in determining what it is you see. That's, I think, if not unique to kaleidoscopes, it's certainly indicative of them. And I think that's in part why people like them. They have something some control over what they see, although they do not have an opportunity to actually.
Sorry, I don't understand. Please say that again.
There's a phone in the background, just as we're talking about phones.
I think Alexa is having an experience here. I'm sorry about that. So I think that interaction with people, between people and kaleidoscopes, is part of their appeal.
I guess we have to invite Alexa onto the show, or
try not to do that.
Okay. So there's a. Do you believe that's still important? Is it important for this art to survive? Is it important for people? Don't ask Alexa this.
Excuse me.
One moment. Okay, we've never had this kind of a technical interlude, but there's a time and a place for everything. And Marshall will return momentarily. Okay. All right. Don't tell us what you did to Alexa.
That's between Alexa and myself. That's
okay. So in any event, we're talking about the unique aspects that you think are still that distinguish, this art from other things that occupy people's time. and Alexa would be one of them, but applications. I mean, I think when there's a lot of game playing that's done by younger and older folk, and okay, people have been playing games for forever, card games, Scrabble, cribbage, whatever. So I think a lot of people like to be engaged in something where there's an end result. There really isn't an end result with kaleidoscopes. There's a myriad of things you can do with it and see it, but you don't get to a place where you're completing something per se. Is that a negative aspect or a positive aspect of the fascination with kaleidoscopes?
Well, if you're looking for it to come to closure on something, to complete like a jigsaw puzzle or something like that, no, kaleidoscopes are not that. Even if you arrive at a certain pattern as you're operating a kaleidoscope and you think that's the most beautiful pattern there is, well, guess what? You'll never see that pattern again, because the changing nature of what you see is an essential part of the experience. So I think you have to be ready for that and happy with that if you're going to be a kaleidoscope person.
Okay. Let's not fail to let people know how they can see your art both online and actually. Give us you have a studio, but I don't know if you take visitors into the studio. You have a gallery up there and you have your website.
Right. Well, my website is my primary way for people can see my kaleidoscopes. It's the address is opticalwonders.com, all one word. And I maintain a collection of photographs taken of the outsides of kaleidoscopes as well as taken through them. And I invite people to enjoy them that way. If you see something on there that you would like to own, you can email me and we can talk about that. The other way that I show my kaleidoscopes is at a gallery, a very nice gallery in Black Mountain, North Carolina, called Seven Sisters. And they have been very good about showing my kaleidoscopes, and they're available for sale there as well.
So my sense of it as we close here is, again, I've been asking all around this sort of central question. I think that what you do is absolutely exquisitely beautiful. And I believe that people who can have the patience to look at the kaleidoscope, not with a particular objective in mind, can be more healthy in their life. But that's my opinion. I hope you agree, Marshall.
I share it. Yes.
Thank you for being on the show today, Marshall Fisher, my guest.
Thank you.